Most people live inside a comfortable story about how the world works. They believe civilization has evolved beyond brutality, that diplomacy has replaced raw power struggles, that modern nations operate with morality and genuine restraint. But every so often, something happens that shatters that illusion completely. A war begins somewhere in the world, and suddenly everything changes in how nations speak. The same countries that spoke about peace begin speaking about security threats. The same leaders who praised cooperation now justify destruction as necessary. The same societies that condemned violence now celebrate it when it serves their interests. Because peace often hides what power truly is beneath the surface. Peace is not the absence of power struggles between nations. It is simply the moment when those struggles are temporarily controlled, negotiated, or postponed. War removes that control and diplomatic veneer. And when it does, the mask falls away completely. What you see underneath is not evil or virtue, just power operating without the usual disguises. For most of history, people have believed in a comforting story about progress, a story that says civilization has evolved beyond primitive violence, that diplomacy has replaced brutality as the primary tool, that modern nations operate with morality and restraint at their core. But every so often, something happens that shatters that illusion violently. A war begins between nations or groups, and suddenly the language changes in how everyone speaks. The same nations that spoke about peace begin speaking about security concerns. The same leaders who praised cooperation now justify destruction as defense. The same societies that condemned violence now celebrate it when it serves their perceived interests. Because peace often hides what power truly is beneath diplomatic language. Peace is not the absence of power struggles between competing interests. It is simply the moment when those struggles are temporarily controlled through negotiation, or negotiated through carefully balanced threats and incentives, or postponed until conditions change and conflict becomes worth the cost. War removes that control and exposes the reality underneath. And when it does, the mask falls away from power, not because nations become suddenly evil or abandon all principles, but because survival removes the luxury of maintaining comfortable appearances. What you see underneath is not random chaos or pure evil, just power operating without the usual disguises that peace allows. The mechanisms were always there beneath the diplomatic language. The calculations were always happening behind the peaceful rhetoric. The competition for dominance was always active and ongoing. Peace just made it invisible to most people watching. War makes it impossible to ignore anymore. Think about how quickly the narrative changes when conflict begins. Yesterday's war crimes become today's necessary actions for security. Yesterday's unthinkable becomes today's justified response to aggression. Yesterday's moral principles become today's luxuries we can't afford during crisis, not because morality suddenly disappeared from human consciousness, but because power always had priorities that morality served when convenient. And when those priorities are threatened directly, morality becomes flexible. That flexibility was always there beneath the surface. War just makes it visible to everyone watching. One of the most uncomfortable truths about human systems is this simple fact. Morality in politics is rarely permanent or consistently applied. It adapts to circumstances constantly. It bends when pressure increases. It changes depending on who holds power and who threatens it directly. Philosophers like Machiavelli understood this centuries ago through careful observation. Nations preach virtue when they are stable and unthreatened. But when their position is threatened by competitors, survival becomes the only rule that matters. Suddenly, actions that were once condemned become justified as necessary. Bombing becomes protection of innocent civilians. Sanctions become defense of international order. Violence becomes necessity for maintaining peace. Not because morality vanished from the decision makers, but because power quietly rewrote it to serve immediate needs. The language changes to fit new circumstances, but the underlying logic remains the same across all situations. Preserve power at any cost. Protect position against all threats. Eliminate threats before they eliminate you. Everything else becomes negotiable depending on circumstances. Watch how quickly moral standards shift when war begins. The same actions that were condemned last year become praised this year. The same tactics that were called barbaric become called strategic. The same leaders who spoke about human rights ignore them when inconvenient. Not because they're uniquely hypocritical compared to their predecessors, because power operates on a logic that exists beneath moral language. That logic is simple and consistent across all systems. Do what preserves your position and eliminates threats to it. Morality is the language used to justify those actions to others, but the actions themselves follow power logic, not moral logic. This doesn't mean all leaders are purely cynical or completely amoral. Many genuinely believe in the moral frameworks they present publicly, but when those frameworks conflict with power preservation, power wins consistently, and war is when that reality becomes impossible to hide anymore. Another mask that falls during war is the illusion of independent thinking among populations. In peaceful times, people believe they are rational observers of events. They believe they evaluate events objectively based on facts. But war activates something deeper in the human mind than rational thought. Tribal loyalty to the in-group. Suddenly people divide the world into two sides without nuance, us and them with nothing between. Nuance disappears from public discourse completely. Complex conflicts become simplified narratives that everyone can understand. Heroes and villains with clear moral distinctions. Good and evil with no gray areas. This is not accidental or unique to certain populations. It is psychological and universal across cultures. Humans evolved in tribes competing for survival. And when survival feels threatened, the brain defaults to the oldest rule it knows instinctively. Protect your group against outside threats, even if the full truth is complicated and ambiguous, even if the situation is morally gray rather than clear. War doesn't just reveal the psychology of leaders making decisions. It reveals the psychology of entire populations reacting emotionally. Watch how quickly people who pride themselves on critical thinking abandon complexity. They stop asking difficult questions about their own side's actions. They stop acknowledging legitimate grievances from the other side. They stop seeing humans on the other side as fully human. Not because they're stupid or uniquely tribal, because the brain is doing what it evolved to do under threat. Simplify reality into us versus them for survival. Increase loyalty to the in-group for cohesion. Dehumanize the out-group to reduce moral hesitation. This happens automatically and unconsciously in most people. They don't choose to think tribally during war. They just find themselves doing it without realizing the shift. And this psychological shift is what makes populations willing to support actions they would have condemned before the tribal switch activated. Leaders understand this psychology even if they don't articulate it explicitly. They know that war creates unity through simplified narratives and tribal loyalty. They know that complexity is the enemy of mobilization. They know that questioning your own side feels like betrayal during conflict. So they speak in simple terms and clear moral frameworks, not to deceive necessarily, but to work with how human psychology operates. And populations respond exactly as expected throughout history, with loyalty, with simplified thinking, with moral certainty. War removes the mask of rational, independent thought from entire societies. Real geopolitical conflicts are incredibly complex in their actual dynamics. They involve decades of accumulated history and grievances, hidden alliances that aren't visible to public observation, economic interests that drive decisions beneath stated reasons, strategic positioning for future conflicts beyond current ones. But the public rarely hears the full complexity of these situations. Instead, they hear simple stories that fit familiar patterns. Because power understands something about human attention and mobilization, people mobilize around clear narratives with obvious villains, not complicated realities that require sustained attention. So the messaging becomes simple and emotionally clear. We are defending ourselves against unprovoked aggression. They are the aggressor who started this conflict. We are protecting freedom and democratic values. They are threatening stability and international order. These narratives are not always lies in the strict sense, but they are rarely the full truth of the situation. They are simplified versions of reality designed to maintain unity among populations and justify action that might otherwise be questioned more carefully. Because when nations go to war, perception becomes a weapon as important as bombs. The battle for how the conflict is understood shapes everything else. Who gets international support and who gets isolated diplomatically? Who can maintain public backing and who loses it quickly? Who is seen as defending themselves and who is seen as aggressing? These perceptions matter more than the complex reality underneath. So power invests heavily in controlling the narrative from the beginning. Through media, through official statements, through carefully released information. Not necessarily through lies, but through selective framing of truth, emphasizing certain facts while downplaying others that complicate the story, presenting defensive actions while ignoring provocative actions that preceded them, highlighting enemy atrocities while minimizing your own side's questionable actions. This is not unique to any particular nation or ideology. It is how power operates during conflict across all systems. Because complex truth doesn't mobilize populations or maintain unity under pressure. Simple, morally clear narratives do that job effectively, and power needs that mobilization to sustain conflict over time. So simplicity is not a bug in how war is communicated. It is a feature that serves power's needs perfectly. Most people think wars are about ideology and moral principles, religion and incompatible belief systems, justice for past wrongs and grievances, freedom versus tyranny in clear terms. But behind those visible reasons, there is usually something more practical driving decisions. Influence over regions and international institutions, territory that provides strategic advantage, resources that fuel economies and military capabilities, strategic dominance for future conflicts and positioning. Throughout history, wars have often been fought over who controls the systems that shape the future. Trade routes that connect economies and enable wealth, energy supply that powers industries and militaries, geographic advantage that controls access points, political influence that shapes rules and norms. Ideology becomes the language used to explain the conflict to populations. But power is usually the engine driving it beneath that language. This does not mean leaders are purely cynical with no genuine beliefs. But it does reveal something important about priorities under pressure. When survival and dominance are involved, ideals often take second place to practical concerns. Think about how often stated reasons for war differ from actual strategic objectives. The public narrative emphasizes freedom, justice, security, moral obligation. The strategic reality involves resources, positioning, influence, dominance. Both can be true simultaneously without contradiction. Leaders may genuinely believe in the moral framework they present, but their decisions are ultimately driven by practical calculations of power. Will this action strengthen our position or weaken it? Will this move increase our influence or diminish it? Will this outcome secure our interests or threaten them? These are the questions that drive decisions when conflict begins. The moral language is how those decisions get justified to populations. But the decisions themselves follow power logic consistently. This is not a criticism of any particular nation or system. It is an observation about how all systems operate when stakes are high. Morality serves power when convenient and gets rewritten when inconvenient. Resources and strategic positioning drive actual decisions beneath moral rhetoric, and war is when that reality becomes impossible to hide completely. Because the costs are too high and the stakes too clear, to pretend it's purely about principles that transcend practical interests. Eventually, every war reaches a moment when the world becomes exhausted by conflict. Resources are drained beyond what nations can sustain. Public support fades as costs become visible and personal. The cost becomes too visible to ignore or justify anymore. And something interesting happens in how nations speak again. Diplomacy returns as the preferred language. Peace negotiations begin after being impossible before. Leaders speak again about stability and cooperation. Cooperation and mutual interests over competition. International order and respect for sovereignty. The language of morality slowly comes back into official statements. The mask returns to cover power's face again. But now you understand something most people never notice about this cycle. That mask was never the true face of power itself. It was simply the version of power that appears when conflict is paused temporarily. Because war does not create the struggle for dominance between powers, it only reveals it by removing the diplomatic veneer temporarily. The competition was always there beneath the peaceful surface. The calculations were always happening behind cooperative rhetoric. The maneuvering for advantage was always ongoing. Peace just made it invisible to populations not paying close attention. War made it impossible to ignore for anyone watching. And once the conflict pauses, the mask comes back automatically, not because power suddenly became moral again, but because maintaining the mask serves power's interests during peace. It allows for trade, cooperation, alliance building that serves long-term positioning. It maintains legitimacy with populations who prefer comfort to truth. It preserves the international order that benefits those currently in power. So the mask returns naturally when conflict pauses, and most people forget what they saw when it fell. they return to believing the comfortable story about evolved civilization, about morality guiding international relations and principled leadership, about diplomacy reflecting genuine commitment to peace over power. But once you see that pattern clearly, you cannot unsee it. You understand that peace is not the opposite of war, it is just a different phase of the same power dynamics. The competition continues beneath diplomatic language and cooperative frameworks. The maneuvering for advantage never stops, just changes tactics. The struggle for dominance remains constant across peace and war. War removes the mask and reveals the face underneath. Peace allows the mask to return and resume its function, but the face beneath was always there. And now you understand the world differently from most people, not through comforting narratives about progress and morality, but through the quiet mechanics of power itself, operating continuously.